Hello. Transforming judgment, transforming self-judgment. Is there another form of judgment other than self-judgment? When we judge, are we simply externalizing something and judging ourselves when we judge others? These are good questions. A question I want to pose right off the bat is, when we worry about what others think of us, it's a very human trait. When we worry about what others think of us, are we really worried about their judgment? Are they really worried what they're going to say about us or they're going to think about us? I would question that. I would say actually what we're really worried about, what we're really afraid of is our own self-judgment, because we are scared, but we don't see that we're going to judge ourselves. So they may say something negative about us, but actually we're going to agree with it. So that's actually what we're really afraid of. And I think that's a really important beginning insight. To really look at that in your life. I invite you to really look at that. When you consider how many things are motivated by your wish to be seen in a good light by others, your wish to be liked, to please others. And those things are deep in us. And even like if you're a rebellious type who says, I don't care what anyone thinks of me, actually you're still in a reaction to that same fear. You're just in a reaction to it, so you're still caught in a little bit by its loop in a dynamic. So these are great things, I think, to consider when you think about yourself and you're thinking about all the actions in your life that may be motivated by whether or not you're going to judge yourself unfavorably according to what someone else thinks or says, or what you project that they might think or say. And, that's that's a big thing, especially when it comes to like thinking of our parents and, our peers and all those around us, who might be in judgment over us in some way, especially if we make a cock up. So something to think about. But what I really wanted to do here today is discuss a little bit deeper than that. I want to follow this thread of self-judgment. And I want to follow it because, these transformational dialogues are based on the gene keys. And at the lowest frequency inside us, we have this pattern of self-judgment. And then at the highest potential, at the other end, we have perfection. So we are perhaps measuring ourselves against a yardstick of perfection. And what is that? What is perfection? Many of us avoid it like the plague. We go, oh no, I don't want to go near that. That doesn't exist. But actually, I want to challenge that assumption because I want to look at the human being as two halves of a whole in a way. And one half of us is the divine, eternal half, and the other half of us is the human, non-eternal, mortal part. And of course, I'm simplifying, and just so that we can have this dialogue, this conversation, right? So I can have this monologue, and hopefully it'll be of use in some way to you. So, yeah, let's say we have that. So that other part of us, that might be 80% of us, or more, that's hidden, that's in the invisible world, that we might call our soul. That is a different kind of entity, a different kind of being. And if you're on a spiritual path of any form, you may have contacted this part of yourself. Perhaps you had a flash. Perhaps you had a big experience where you really touched into your soul body. That incredible, awesome signature of light that lies behind every human being, within every human being, within the heart of us. Our soul. Some teachings call that the causal body, or the body of glory. That's a Christian mystical term. And I love the idea of that because it's like there's this other part of us that is, constantly being perfected and is already perfect. So this is why we resonate at some deep level with the notion of perfection. And when we look at those icons of the Christ, or we think of the Buddha, or we think of these great beings, or whoever they are, the gods and the goddesses and the deities, we can resonate with that because there's a part of us that is a part of that, and we know that. Many of us know that. Not all of us. Some of us have forgotten completely, right? But that you're probably not listening to this. So, the ones who are know what I'm talking about. This soul, this causal body, and the beauty of that is that perfect part of our nature, we can nourish that, and we nourish that through meditation, through prayer, through spiritual practice, through good living, through good behavior, not behavior in the sense of good and bad, but just like selfless acts. So everything we do and everything we learn about ourselves and our mortality, that becomes compost that fuels that body of light. So that body of light can never be tarnished, never. And in fact, it can never go backwards. It can never fall from grace, because it lives on that higher frequency in another realm, but that realm is here right now. And it's like, how much time do you spend nourishing that part of yourself? And we know the things that nourish that part of ourselves. We know that, and even like things that we do wrong. I'm going to say it like that: things that we mistakes that we make that aren't really mistakes, we know. But the only way we know that is because at this other level, we realize eventually that a mistake that we've made actually is compost. It becomes something that we can learn and grow from. And it fuels that eternal nature, that eternal body. It actually adds another dimension, another patina, another nuance, another part of the rainbow of that light body that we are, but we have to harvest through the suffering of our own, errors, if you like, as a human, and we harvest that and we learn from that, and then what we learn goes up into that pure body, and everything else is just discarded back to the earth, if you like. So that's the sort of pure side of our nature that's already perfect. And then we have this very far from perfect human side of us, right? And you might say that's the bit above, if the soul body is 80% of us, beneath the surface like an iceberg, then this little bit at the top, the 20% or the 10% or whatever it is our mortal body. It's our human journey. And it's far from perfect. But it has a resonance to that notion of perfection. And because it has that resonance to the notion of perfection, it's very good at judging itself, because it's sort of like a part of us just goes, well, I could have done a lot better. And that really, and we give ourselves a hard time. And there are things that, we ought to give ourselves a hard time for, in a way, because if we really have, that's part of our nature. Like if we've really done something that's hurt someone else, for example, and if we feel some shame, then that shame is nature's way of telling us that, we're growing and we're learning. And as long as we learn from that shame and then we let go of it and we transcend it, we don't get stuck in it forever and beat ourselves up, then we've learned something of value through that process, right? And obviously there are some of us that never seem to learn in this life. And I would pose the question that, if you don't learn in this life while you're here, you will learn afterwards. In the ancients, they call this the bardo state, when the bodies are separating after we've died, and then we come into pure contact with the consequences of our actions, words, and deeds in the world that we've just lived. Right? And we don't just sort of look at them as a witness. We experience the consequences of our karma, without filters. So if we've caused agony, we experience the agony that we've caused. And we learn from that, not as a punishment, but as a kind of, as a way of going deeper into the learning of our authentic nature. So it's not punishment, it's all evolutionary learning. And anything we do learn, any humility that we gain through that process in whatever realm, that energy, that light goes up into the pure body, and it feeds it and makes it more magnificent, the body of glory. So that part of us, we are always growing and always, it can always be fueled in the world. So that means that it's just a matter of what do we spend our time doing. And, do we spend all our energy nourishing only the human body? The human, like our desires, following the, the human thing. I want to have this, I want to get this, I want to be this, I want to, which is all human, it's part of the human journey, right? And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But also to realize that we have this other body that will survive, because all the stuff that we've gathered here, all the attainments and money we've made and fame or whatever, once we've gone, it's gone. It's just gone. We don't. It's not ours anymore, because this being has ceased to exist. But the soul behind it is there. So that's why when you think of things like this, you realize, wow, I actually can have both. I can have my cake and eat it. I can be the human that's exploring the human realm and exploring desire and exploring, the journey that comes from desire and need and love and want and all of that, and our relationships and our failings and successes and all of that journey. I can have all that, and food and all the things of the human plane. But I also have this other thing that I'm building constantly, and I'm perfecting it. I'm polishing that gem of my soul, that can never die, and so it can, as I said, it can never be tarnished. It's perfection that's going on being perfected even more and even more. It's eternal perfecting. And yet on the human plane, it's all imperfection, and we're striving for that beauty and those incredible higher states, and we may experience them from time to time. But it's all about how do we integrate these two essential parts of our nature, human and divine. And of course, they're not separate. But for the purpose of this monologue, I'm looking at them as separate. So how do we integrate them? And if we I put it to you that we can see ourselves as a spectrum, of all these different traits, and even the mistakes we make and what we call the shadows, and the hurt that we cause, and then the times that we beat ourselves up and judge ourselves, and all of that stuff, it becomes fuel for the higher body in time. That doesn't mean that we get off the hook, not at all, because the only way that becomes fuel is if it's gone through a transformation process. Otherwise, it doesn't become the fuel that feeds our soul's journey. So it's up to us, if we process it in this life, through fully taking responsibility for our actions, our words, our thoughts, all of that, through fully taking that in, then, we will kind of leave this world in a way complete, rather than incomplete, and then perhaps we have to recycle and come back and learn that lesson again until we've really mastered it. But it's all polishing the beautiful gemstone of our eternal nature. And that gives us this perspective that it's okay to make mistakes. As long as we harvest them and we get some compost out of them, and we don't beat ourselves up unnecessarily over and over and over again, we forgive ourselves truly deep in our heart, and then we're able to move on, and then we've learned something of incredible value, and that body of glory glows even brighter. And we feel that. We actually feel that. So whatever you're facing in your life right now, let it be a compost, let it become compost that fuels that higher aspect of your nature. And don't beat yourself up so much over it. Just, work yourself into it, breathe yourself through it. Try and just find the beautiful morsels of grace that are somewhere hidden inside it, even though you may not feel that yet. One day you may feel that, and you may be able to let it go, and you'll be able to move on, and a new you will emerge. And that soul body, that aspect of our nature, we want to give as much attention to that as we can in the world. Some people give up a whole lifetime just to sit with that, just to nurture and nourish that. I'm not saying we should do that, because that's a certain path for certain people. The rest of us, we can do it. We can do it as and when we feel the need to, and it does make us feel better because we contact that part of ourselves when we tune in. And if we neglect it and we fall into the human realm too far, we get lost, and we get depressed, and we get lonely, and we get all these things. And so it's really important to keep connecting back into that eternal part of our nature and realize it's there, and it's always there, that light of our soul. And there are so many practices and teachers and teachings out there that will help us. Follow your heart, follow your intuition, and you'll find those things. But I hope this is helpful for you, just to understand that these different sides of our nature, the human and the divine, and how they're part of an integrated field. And hope that's helpful to you, and that it helps you to be a little bit gentler on yourself and less worried about what others may or may not think of us. Okay. Yeah, blessings.